You're about to listen to an archived episode of The Night Shift with Zeno Hiroman. This is brought to you commercial-free by the Surfcast Podcast. If you're interested in more historical, educational, and entertaining surf fishing content, check out weekly episodes of the Surfcast Podcast available today on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and anywhere else you get your podcasts, including www.surfcastpodcast.com.
Speaking of needlefish, I mean, this was a huge part of the surfcasting history, and not because it's the greatest lure ever made, but in some ways it's one of the rare lure that was actually kind of invented in our generation. Nothing was invented, okay? I'm not going to go there, but it was in its current form came alive during those Block Island years. Correct? What was your experience with needlefish? Like, give me an idea how you came to be such a big fan of needlefish. Like, where did you start it? Where did you see first one, and what it meant for you during your fishing years?
Well, in the fishermen, I think it was still the Long Island fishermen back then, not sure, but there was an ad for some needlefish. They were classic needlefish. They were 3 for $10, I think. And I said I was just going to buy some, and they were only available in 3 colors. I think I bought $20 worth of them. And I told my friend Marty, I says, I'm going to buy some of these. And he looked at it, and he bought some too. And anyway, I was in the Cape, and I was just leaving the Cape. I was saying goodbye to Mike DeSimeone and Tony Sharappo, that owns the Bass Run at different times. And as I was leaving, the UPS truck stopped in front of Bass Run. So my truck was already running, but I turned it off and I went back in. So they said, "Oh, it's a package from Donnie." So inside the package was some wood 3-hook needlefish, the ones with the 60-pound swivels. But this is new. I didn't own any, and I just grabbed 3 of them. I grabbed 3 of them just for the heck of it. Although those guys always gave me, good breaks on everything, I knew that I had no expectation to use them. I just bought them because I was a plug junkie. So I figured I could get more from Donnie over the winter. So I just grabbed them. Now I had my classic needlefish and my Donnie needlefish. I then went to Block Island, and the fish were on needlefish, and I couldn't believe that that's what I was using. So the classics got destroyed. I mean, as fast as you could tie them on, the fish would just pull the screw eyes out. So I only had the 3 Donnie needlefish to use, and they were quite effective. And the island was filled with fish and no needlefish. So Donnie was nice enough to mail me some. I called him up, desperate, and he sent them up the next day. So my friends and I were lucky enough to have needlefish, but guys were using pieces of wood dowel. They were wrapping lead solder around boom needle. They were doing whatever they could do. There were no needlefish to be had. The only needlefish that existed were just whatever was on the island. It's not like you were going to go and buy a needlefish somewhere and bring it there that I know of.
Well, how bad was your percentage of catching if you didn't have the needlefish versus if you had a needlefish?
Well, yeah.
Obviously it's going to be something here that I want to hear.
Well, what happened was I went to Block. Russell was with me, like I said. We went straight from the Cape to Block. And I was there a few days, and next thing you know, Marty and Al show up. And I told Marty, I says, better get those needlefish out that I suggested that you buy, because that's the only thing these fish seem to be hitting. They were hitting other things too, but I mean, for the most part. So anyway, Alfred was like, he saw what the needlefish was. He's like, I'm not using that POS. Yes, you know what I mean?
Of course.
So that night, he says, I fished next to you all night, he said. He goes, I got one bump. He says, I think that fish bumped my bottle plug on the way to your needlefish because I don't think it was interested in my plug. Well, that was it. He fished the entire night, he didn't have one single fish. And Russell and I and Marty, we had 3 or 4 or 5 30 and 40 pounders each on needlefish. And Alfred, it took one night, and Alfred was sold the next day. He was begging for needlefish. And he eventually got one from Marty, but he wasn't getting one from me. So,
I think Donnie, if I remember the story, Donnie came up with that needlefish as an idea from, I think, also Boone. And when he was at the Cape with Charlie Ruger, I think that's the story that he told me. That was his original inspiration for that size.
That was the year earlier. He
Yes.
was up at the race, and I think maybe at Hatches Harbor. I'm not sure of the spot, but they had some small bass and some bluefish on the needlefish, but some locals up there were using the needlefish. That's why he decided to make a few, but they were virtually unknown, and they were still being touted as like the stupidest lure ever made by anyone who ever saw one, because it just went against everything that anybody else was used to fishing. You know, there was no resistance. There was no apparent action. No one really knew what to do with it. It's not like a Rebel. You see it going from side to side when you reel it in. You just cast it out and reel it in. But you know what? That's what it took. Just cast it out and reel it in. The fish wanted it. So,
I disagree with the statement that needlefish doesn't do anything I'll take that to my grave, because I think it's one of the most versatile, greatest lure ever invented. Just because it doesn't have the slope or your metal lip to give you some action, that doesn't mean it doesn't have any action. Especially, the other thing is, speaking of Donnie, and I know all these, I'm not putting Donnie above anybody else or Danny or anybody else, but Donnie is like you. I feel he has a very inquisitive mind, and he also pays attention to details.
No doubt.
Because I've heard him explain things, the way he's seen things and the way he uses that into his designs is almost like what you did with plugs and being aware of your surroundings.
Just Donnie's obviously an observant person, and he's got very high standards for himself and for his lures, and he just didn't sell anything. I'm not saying he didn't sell anything that didn't work, or he didn't sell anything that was not as good as it could be. He what he sold is he made the best things he could make the way he thought they should be made, with the best materials that were available to him, and he's just a very observant person. So a lot of times it probably cost him fish when he was experimenting with his plugs, whereas maybe somebody else would have just changed to somebody else's plugs. Maybe he kept his on. I don't really know, but I do know that there were very few plugs of his that he made that I was not a fan of. There were a couple, but for the most part, he made really good stuff.
No, I agree.
Really
I mean, I've listened to him explain to me how the small bass feeds in the whitewater and what happens after the whitewater recedes and how the metal lip appears. And it's all this thing until I actually put into practice where I could say, holy shit, he's absolutely 100% right. But again, he's seen things more than just casting a plug and retrieving it and hoping for a hit. He actually paid attention the whole way through every part of the wave to see how it reacts different with the condition. Is my point is he paid really attention to the details, and he shows in his plugs. Like, he can explain to you why the eyes might be recessed, why the slope on a darter, and why the lip is certain way. It's not just done for cosmetic reasons. Is my point.
No, exactly. Donnie really was not a gimmick person. He did things for a reason, and the reason was he did things because he felt it was a better way to doing them, and that's why he did it that way.
I agree with you. What was the story with the wad? How did that came about? Obviously, needlefish, you guys were crushing the fish on needlefish. Wad came, it's a larger version of needlefish, almost like a super strike on steroids.
That's exactly what it was. Well, I had this idea over the winter about having a bigger needlefish, so my friend Alfred came over. He was a haircutter by trade, so he would always come over and give me haircuts, and we would BS all night about tackle and things like that. So I told him I had this idea for this big needlefish, and boy, he laughed right in my face. And And so did everybody else. No one was sold on this idea. So anyway, I went to Donnie and I told him I want a bigger model needlefish. And Donnie was just transitioning to plastic. And he's like, I'm not making any more wood plugs. It's no one's a 3-ounce needlefish. He's like, no one's going to want it. No one's going to want it but you. No one's going to have the right tackle to cast it. It's not going to be, So then I tried to convince him to make it a slot in his plastic mold. And he's like, no. It's like cost many thousands of dollars to make a plug. And he felt like it was a plug that no one really would want. So anyway, I wasn't giving up on it. And I really didn't have any way of having it made. So my friend who worked for Grumman, he said, maybe I can do something for you. And he spoke to a friend of his who was a machinist, George. His name is quite widely known now. And I only knew George as a casual acquaintance of my friends who worked at Grumman's because they both worked at Grumman's. So long story short, George agreed to make some of these plugs. Now, he had no idea probably he was making them for me. He was making them for my friend. So my friend called me up and he said, George is bringing the plugs to Democrat. This guy, George, spent weekends at Democrat Point. So I said, okay, I'll go there. So I went there. The next thing you know, he just pulls these wads out, and he's got a big crowd of people around him, and most people weren't interested in them, but I thought they were for me. So I spoke to my friend, and I basically, no two were the same. Some weighed a half ounce more than the others. Well, I went through them, and he had all the weights marked on them. I just bought all the heavy ones that I can. Some of them were quite light. I didn't want those. I bought all the heavy ones, a color I could care less in. So anyway, I bought those, and I brought them over to Block, and I didn't use them like the first month because the regular stuff was working. But there just came a time where it wasn't really, the fishing really wasn't that good. So I put on the wad and I instantly hooked up, and I was walking past Alfred in the lineup, and I remember saying it was on the wad. So he thought it was lucky. I thought it was a lucky hit. The fish were only hitting the wad. No one else was catching anything. No matter where I used it, fish were jumping on it, and I ended up with a 50 on it on full moon night. And it was a really good plug. So now none of my friends had them. I was the only one who had any of them. So I lent a couple out to my friends, and they had to fish them in rotation because I just didn't have that many. So they were sharing them. So anyway, that next winter, I had one that was destroyed by a fish. It had no nose grommet, and most of the fish I was catching on it were on the tail hook, despite everyone else saying they hit the head hook on the tail hook, which drove the wire into the nose of the plug and split it. So the plug was no longer usable. So like I do with a lot of plugs, I just take a hacksaw, I cut them in half to see what makes them tick. And I brought it over to Donnie over the following winter, and I said, you really got to make this plug. So now when Donnie saw that his plug was being copied by somebody else, he said, okay, I'll make you some. And I wanted 300, but I got 120, but they were the only 120 that were made. So the following year, my friends got, what I was able to get to them, the wads, and they were really good plugs. And now the wad seems to be quite, everyone's making wads. So I don't know if everyone's catching on them, but the wad was a really good plug, and it didn't really take many fish under 25 or 30 pounds. It's catching all big fish on them too. So it was a good plug. That's all.
I agree. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I gave it back to my friends who were teasing me. I teased them right back. Believe me. That's the way we work.
I mean, I find the wad to take a larger fish than average, and not as many. That was my experience with it. I always like the plug personally, but something that you just said struck me as something that I should maybe bring up. You said that the color didn't matter where you picked up the plug at demo because you were going to paint them yourself, correct?
Exactly.
So to you, painting a plug on a beach with the can, it was just a part of a daily ritual, if it had to be done. It wasn't a big deal.
Not a big deal. I've been carrying spray paint with me ever since I had got a driver's license. I carried spray paint. So I probably had a dozen cans at all times in the back of my truck, every color. I didn't have at the time. I wasn't able to. I mean, I ended up with a lot of plugs, but I didn't start out with a lot of plugs like everybody else. I ended up having a few, so I might have to take my white plug, might have to be a black plug the next night, and maybe a white plug the following night. So I just painted things as needed. That's all.
Well, you said you were a plug junkie, and that's fine. And I've seen how many plugs you had in the basement. And I always assume there's something to being fearful of not having whatever it's working. And this is why you have so many. I mean, I'm going to let you explain why did you have so many plugs?
Well... Like I was trying to explain before, I feel there's kind of a couple of kinds of fishermen. There's those who don't need a lot of plugs, and there's those who need a lot of plugs. And what you lack in confidence, you make up in selection. And for me, I didn't want to hear that they were hitting on anything that I didn't have. But I soon turned it to be the opposite way. I used it to my advantage, knowing that you didn't have it. So if I knew I was using something and I was the only one to have it, I was either going to sink on my own or I was going to swim on my own. But if I was when you were catching fish on something and someone else didn't have what they needed to catch fish, it's kind of being hurtful. And I didn't want to be the one getting hurt. I would rather distribute the hurt to other people, so to speak. So the popular plugs was always just trying to keep like a leg up on the competition, so to speak, to try to have something that not everybody had.
How competitive were you in a way of a whole persona? I'm not going to say maybe catching fish or selling fish was maybe one part of it, having the biggest fish. There's a lot of ways of being competitive. And one thing you weren't and never were, even to this day, is wanted to be some social media or even then in a papers being written about. That wasn't your style. But how competitive were you amongst your crew and then against everyone else?
There was never, ever any kind of discussion I could recall about any of us being competitive with anybody.
I'm not surprised.
It was just the way things were done. It is, everyone wants to be the last guy standing, and sometimes I was, and sometimes I wasn't. But it had nothing to do. But for me, if I saw a guy catch a fish, it really hurt me. If he caught it, I didn't catch that fish. It really would bother me. So if that's what you like, then I would say I was very competitive. If what you mean is comparing things, no one compared anything. No one knew what I caught or didn't catch, and the only ones who knew what my friends caught would be me. So, I mean, it's not like we were so we weren't competitive in that manner. I mean, we never entered any contests or any of that stuff. So I guess competitive, but not in a manner that most people would think competitive means, so to speak.
I think I can relate to that. I think I understand what you're trying to say. It was just a way of the way you guys lived your lives and the way you fished as a crew, and it wasn't matter what everybody else doing it. You just wanted to do better than everybody else in some ways. Meaning if somebody was catching fish, you wanted a part of that. And then when you got part of it, you wanted to do better than anyone else because that's, after all, that's why you were there.
I didn't know how anybody else was doing. I had no way to compare notes. No, how do I know what you caught unless you tell me? So I just didn't say anything to anyone about anything, and neither did anyone else. It was just different. That's all. It wasn't like, I don't think anyone was actually trying to compete with anyone that I'm aware of. If I went to a spot, I mean, why would I want to fish with 30 guys when I could fish by myself? Sometimes I fish with 30 guys, but automatically I'm reducing my chances 29 times less. If I fish by myself, I'm going to be the only one to catch the fish or the only one to not catch the fish.
I knew that was coming. I was laughing over here. I just let you finish, the 29, times less chance. I mean, yes, you're 100% right.
Yeah. It's the same kind of mindset about everything else. You divide it into blocks, let's say, and what's going to give you your best chances of doing things. It's, sometimes you have to fish in a lineup, but you know what? Sometimes you really don't have to fish in a lineup, and people fish in a lineup because it's a crutch. They feel if 3 other guys cast in there, they might know something that I don't. But those 3 guys are probably thinking maybe you know something that they don't. So it's, as long as you have confidence in your own abilities, I think that you know what a good spot looks like. I spent a lot of time not only studying the different plugs, but observing the water and seeing what happens is just when a little breeze blows some water in and when the water goes in and out, how the bubble weed responds, how this responds, how everything responds. And I just feel that it's just a matter of observation, that a lot of people don't take the time to do. I mean, I don't really know how to explain it other than I think that people look a lot deeper into things than they really need to. They think it's got to be a lot more complicated. Everyone has to realize there's always going to be a certain percentage of things that they're not going to understand or not have an explanation for, but it just, for instance, there's either in Block and the Cape, it's the same thing. You try a few spots and boom, you fish right away at those couple of spots. So the next night you'll get there 2 hours earlier. Now, the 2 hours earlier, you get there and now you catch fish 2 hours earlier. But of course you stay to the hot time of the previous night and now there's nothing. So what just happened? Well, I came up with a theory about what happened is certain fish set up in spots dependent on a tide, and certain fish set up in spots dependent on who knows what, the structure or whatever. So if you would have showed up the 2 hours later, like you did the previous night, you would have caught fish when you showed up. But since you showed up 2 hours early, you caught them then. If you would have showed up 2 hours earlier than that, you would have caught them then. So I started realizing that certain spots the tide is more important than other spots. But again, who's to say who's right and who's wrong? But if you start realizing these pieces fit together quite handily, and maybe it's not a coincidence, you could use those things to your advantage. Like anyone who's ever wetsuited, anyone who's ever gone to a rock, anyone even in waders, like I realized why every time I walk to a rock does the water get deeper around the rock. It seems every time I get to within 5 feet of that rock, now the water's over my head all of a sudden. So I started looking, and it seemed to me to be quite common sense. Whether it's correct or not, it's my belief, is that when the water moves, it can't move the rock. It's simple as that. So it has to go around the rock. You only see the tip of the iceberg. When you're looking, you see the water splash over the top of the rock. What's happening under the water that you don't see? One of the things that's happening is the water is going sideways around the rock in both directions, and it's also digging a channel around the rock when it goes down. So every rock has deeper water around it than the surrounding terrain. So that means every time you cast next to a rock, there's a force of the water pushing your plug away from that rock that you don't realize is there. But it has to be there, because if it wasn't there, you wouldn't have deeper water around that rock. So it's kind of like little things like that. Is like you could target your plug like right on top of the rock, because by the time your plug gets adjacent to the rock, that water has pushed the belly of the line away from that rock. And you can get your plug to swim much closer to the area where if you just cast and you're not aware of that, your plug might end up several feet away from the rock. And you think it's not where you think it is, because the water is acting in three-dimensional, but most people only see one dimension. They see the surface of the water, they see a rip current, they see it breaking around the rock, they see things, but they're only seeing what they see, not what's underwater. And you have to take everything that's going on and put it into the picture. And that's just part of being observant. And some people are and some people are not. So I think that most of the times, like I always have to think, when someone's too lucky, maybe luck doesn't have too much to do with it at all. So when you start seeing like, wow, that guy is lucky, he caught fish again, maybe he's not lucky. Maybe luck has little to do with it. Maybe he just knows something that you don't know, or maybe he just interprets something differently than you interpret it. So, I mean, we all have our own ideas.
Yeah, I mean, you come back to the observance again for the 1000th time, but that's just a simple, a mind exercise that I guess some people don't use. They just want to be told where to go and what to cast. Not that we're discussing other people. I couldn't care less what other people does. I'm like you. I do what I do, and you. It's funny. I mean, obviously, this is about you, and I don't in any way want to put myself in any even light years away from you. But my opinion always was on fishing. I was never going to be the greatest fisherman, but I was always going to stay longer than you were. was going to outlast you, outfish you, by sheer desire to do so. So my point is, there's other ways to have good results that not necessarily all have to be having the greatest plugs or having the greatest information. And your observing of things it's not only legendary, it's fascinating to me to listen to. The dry suits you had, obviously, you were one of the first people that wore dry suit in a surf that I know of, bro.
I was the second one that I was aware of. The first one was Gary Hall. He wore a kayaker's dry suit, which did not have anything on the feet. So anyway, after what happened at Block on the snowstorm blitz at 87, at that time I was in the wetsuit. And I actually had two wetsuits. I had an 1/8 inch and a 1/4 inch. I was wearing them one on top of the other because the water was so cold. I felt like the Michelin Man. So there were a couple of other people who showed up on Block from Montauk, like the Bragan crew and all those guys, and they were wetsuiting. So, they think they were the first ones wetsuiting, but they weren't. But nevertheless, I learned, because I had a little bit of a head start, that Block is a very different place than most places. Most places seem to be tide specific, whereas Block seems to be 24/7, 365 days a year. You can go anywhere at any time and catch fish or get skunked. So there weren't any the tide's dropping 2 hours, I better get to the North Bar type of mindsets. No one really knew when to get anywhere. So it was a waste to put on a wetsuit, and then I know how long I could last in a wetsuit. You're good for 4 or 5 hours in that wetsuit, especially if you're not catching fish. And then you're out of the wetsuit. And then pretty much you're done for the night. So what I was doing was I was fishing at certain tide stages in my waders, and then I would put on the wetsuit. I would pick my best chance of being able to fish somewhere alone in the wetsuit where I would have no competition, and I would take that opportunity and say, okay, I know I could make 6 hours in a wetsuit in these freezing conditions, and I'd be able to fish that. So the following year, the winter of 87, I started researching dry suits. And I had previously spoken to Gary about his, but not having any footwear attached was a deal breaker for me, because that just wasn't going to do it. So I started researching, and I found a company called DUI, one of the best known companies to make dry suits. So I went and I got measured for my dry suit in Freeport, and Marty and Al said they wanted one too. Now this is going back to the winter of '87. They were $1,800 back then. So they made us the 3 suits. I had it reinforced with Cordura. I had this. I had that. I had all these genius ideas. Got the suit, leaked like a sieve.
Oh,
leaked like a sieve. Brought it back, and I said, leaks like a sieve. They sent it back to the manufacturer. Marty and Al brought theirs back too. Theirs leaked like a sieve. Sent it back. Manufacturer, they gave it back to us again. Leaked like a sieve. Now, $1,800 is a lot of money now, let alone in 1987.
Yeah, I'm sure.
So I went back and I said, these suits aren't going to make it for us. They're not doing it. So I found another company. I actually got the store to credit us 100% of the money back on these custom-made suits. They felt we were right, and they took it up with the manufacturer, and I got to say that was quite nice of them. I found another suit, and this suit was $3,000 in 1987.
Ouch.
So I Marty, Al, and myself all drove. We had to drive all the way down to Delaware to get fitted for these suits. We went down there and we got fitted for the suits. And the suits ended up working. They worked fantastic. They worked great. They were a lot of money. I ended up buying a second one. They worked so good. And they had wader boots on, what they called Wellington boots, and I was able to use my caulkers on it. And it did not replace a wetsuit, but it kind of was like being able to stay in your waders all night long. And if you wanted to take a coffee break for a half an hour, you just dip and step back. And you were comfortable as can be, and you were able to fish from dusk to daybreak, something you could never do in a wetsuit in those brutally cold conditions. And after that, a couple more friends got those suits, those $3,000 suits. They got them made also. So it ended up being a really good thing. It kept me in the water when I otherwise wouldn't have been in the water.
Yeah, that's true. So, I don't see anyone wearing them these days, to be honest with you. I don't think last time I saw, because some of these suits are not wetsuits. Are always going to be wetsuits, but some of these suits that they make, these tabs are so, they do keep you dry. But then again, there's other reasons why you want to have a dry suit. Now that you mentioned it, the Blitz of '87. I mean, this is something that Dennis wrote about. Give me your experience of that event, because in some way it is considered to be an event only because the way it all came about, and obviously the size of the fish. So tell me your memories. I would like to hear, if you don't mind sharing it.
Well, I remember I usually went to block in October, and it usually didn't get good until November. But in October, generally speaking, I was only averaging about 4 fish a week in October in the earlier 80s, but those 4 fish were always over 30 pounds. So it was well worth it for me. So what was happening is I was starting to notice a buildup of bait. I was noticing bait that I had never noticed before. The harbor at Old Harbor was getting black with sand eels, and guys were actually netting them and selling them, so I guess to the Fulton market. I had no idea what they were doing with them. But anyway, every morning I was watching these clouds of sand eels leave the harbor and seagulls working over them. and it just was way too much bait, way too much bait. And I remember I called Alfred and I said, I think you should come up here, and the fishing still wasn't good. The fishing was still a slow pick of fish, but they were good fish, so I was quite content. And then it just started getting, and it was the first year, 87 was the first year that I remember so many smaller fish at Bach. There was a lot of smaller fish under 15 to 20 pounds. So you had the smaller fish and you had the bigger fish. And it just started getting really, really good. And a lot of patterns started to form as far as the fish would hit at a certain tide or a certain spot or things like that. And it just started getting really, really good. And I remember one night I counted 55 guys at Southwest Point, and I left. It was impossible to make. I saw like several 50s taken, but it was impossible to make a cast. There was lines within 1 second. Someone was hooking up, and there were just lines with slugs shaped over it. It was just like total madness. So I remember I just went to the complete opposite side of the island, and there was 2 or 3 guys there, and the fishing was just as good there. We had it all to ourselves and things like that. So it was all you started hearing about was who caught a 50 and how many were caught in one night and things of that nature. But the fishing just was getting really, really good. But a couple of them nights that Dennis has in the book, he picks out specifically 11 nights of the snowstorm blitz. I was there probably for 60 nights. But out of those 11 nights, I bet I got skunked 3 or 4 of them if I were to go back to my logbook. So as much as there were big fish around, it was still easy to zig instead of zagging. I mean, guys, the nights I got skunked, guys caught tons of fish. I just kept making the wrong decisions. So, but the amount of fish that were caught, there was a lot of fish. There was a lot of fish caught over 50 pounds that I remember. It seems like everyone knew someone who caught one. So they were just in there. They were in there, and the wind. It was after the snowstorm. The next night there was nothing, and the following night I was in my wetsuit. Now I was the only one in the wetsuit probably. The water was absolutely freezing. I mean, it was brutally, brutally, brutally cold. You could only last a couple of hours, 2 or 3 hours in a wetsuit. So again, I picked my time. I mean, when I could separate myself from other people in the wetsuit, and I would pick like my best window of opportunity, and I would just use that for my. One night I remember I was giving up for the night. It was, I don't know what time it was, but I went back to the cottage, and my friend Sal left the back of a paper plate. He left a list of fish weights. Nothing that night. And he told me where, and I went there, and he was asleep in his buggy, and he had a few more fish, and he's like, "Can you weigh these for me? I can't read the scale." Sal was a bit older. So he couldn't read the weights on the scale, and he wanted to know if any of them were 50-pounders. They were not, but they were close. So anyway, he's like, "I'm done. I can't make another cast." So I went down there, and I had fish on the first cast. So if he wouldn't have left me that note, I wouldn't have read that note. I wouldn't have went there. So, that was one of the times where it really worked great, like with your friends, you know what I mean? Putting you into fish that otherwise you wouldn't have caught. 87 was quite a year. That's for sure.
Now,
it was a good year.
Now, a lot of fish today, and I know that you're not here, but obviously you can see it from reading online stuff, what's going on and how small these fish are, most of them. I wonder if there's any way to maybe transport us back to those days to explain to us just how big, not how big the big fish were, but just how many big fish were there in compared to small? Because I'm just going to relate a small story that I heard when I met Fred Schwab, who was one of my heroes when I was a kid and I came to this country. And Fred would say, like, he would fish the Jones Beach and he'd be like, I got 2 fish in a month and they were both 30 or 40 pounds. There just weren't a lot of small fish around. Can you kind of paint us a picture of what the fishery was then?
In the 80s?
Yeah. Was there a time where most of the fish, you weren't going to catch many, but they were all big? And how big?
Well, in the 80s, block seems to kind of be in a unique situation. Most every place else was really poor in the 80s. In the early 80s, the Cape was still good, but in the general 80s, I mean, the fishery was in the crapper. For whatever reason, Block Island was surrounded by fish. And my first trip was in 1980, and I did have a couple. I was only there 2 or 3 nights. I had a couple of fish over 30 pounds, but I was not ready to give the Cape up for it. That's for sure. So the following year, I didn't even go. And then I think I went the next year. I went in 82. I think in 82, I was back there after that. But it was kind of hard to trade the Cape for Block Island because the Cape was still, the Cape. There was a lot of big fish taken by a lot of people there, and I felt more comfortable in the Cape. I felt like I had a better idea of what I was doing. I had a better support network with the people that I knew. In Block Island, I basically didn't know anyone and didn't want to know anyone, and no one wanted to know me. So, but the fish in Block, by far, I would say the average fish in Block was 31 to 33 pounds. It just seemed that's just the way it was. And then the odd fish, smaller fish, but I probably fished there for several years before I caught too many fish under 20 pounds. They just weren't there. So I really didn't ask where the small fish were. I didn't want the small fish. I wanted the big fish.
I assume that the Cape Cod fishing was a little bit easier too, meaning you had your truck there, sand, right?
Yeah, the Cape was, to me, it was a lot easier. Most guys didn't even use plug bags. They didn't use eel bags. I was the only guy I ever saw with eel bag. You could run the low water mark, whether it was legal or not, and you're fishing right out of your truck. And instead of plug bags, people had 6 or 8 rigged rods on the front of their buggy, and it was just that they wanted to try a different plug. They would just grab a different outfit type of thing, and that was pretty sweet when you found the fish. But I learned early on in the Cape that easy also means easy for people to see you too.
Easy to get crowded.
Driving,
yeah.
Guys driving down the beach. I learned really quick. In 1977, all my rods were wrapped with yellow and red thread because I like those, the Hornell colors, and I just thought those colors looked really nice. So I had, 15 rods. I made them all myself. They're all yellow and red. Well, it only took one trip to the Cape to see that when you have a fish on and there's a buggy coming down, even 2 miles down the beach, that light would illuminate every bent rod. So now everyone could see you were into fish. So that winter, I started rewrapping everything in black and gray rods, no light-colored blanks, I was electrical taped over my honey lammy because the color was too visible. And it was really, you could see like a lot. And people who left the clickers in their drags, I was just driving down the beach until I heard someone's drag go off. And then when I heard drag go off, I would stop. So I'm like, if I'm doing it, I don't want someone doing it to me. So,
Well, what you mentioned before, you weren't going, you didn't care who did what, or you didn't know, but yet you did know because you paid attention. Maybe other people weren't, but you sure were paying attention.
Well, no, the way I look at it is like, listen.
If you're going to give me something, I'll take it. That's what you're looking at it.
That's exactly it. I'm not going to look at your hand, but if you're going to tip your cards, I'd be an idiot not to look. You know what I mean? It's just, that's the way it is. If you want to have your dragon, your clicker in for a reason I'll never understand, well, you know.
What is the reason for having a clicker on a drag?
Damned if I know. I could only assume it's for bait fishing. I have no idea. I have no idea why there's a clicker in the drag or why anyone would want one. I never knew anyone to remove them. I'm sure plenty of people removed them before I did, but no one was fishing out of my truck with a clicker. No.
Do you have a certain affinity or love for the certain places that something is really near and dear to you, being that Cape or Block or Montauk, of all the places that you fish? Or do you look at them as just different parts of your life that were different and special in their own way?
Well, they were different. I only basically fished 4 spots in my life. I fished lots of spots a few times, but in my mind, it's better to fish fewer spots and know them better than to fish a lot of spots and not know them at all. So I only fished basically Breezy Point and Montauk in New York and Cape and Block. That's it. So to me, yeah, I could have been doing better in the Cape, but I can't be in the Cape every single night. You know what I mean? I live in New York, so you got to find spots in New York and things like that. So I just basically concentrated on those 4 spots, and that was fine for me. I just try to always be at one of those 4 spots anytime I was able to be anywhere. And again, it just comes down to what's my best odds. Yeah, I could go to Bayville and catch a 7-pounder. Pretty much, I'm more confident I can catch a 7-pounder than a 27-pounder if I went to Breezy. But do I really care if I catch a 7-pounder? You know what I mean? I just always try to put myself, just play the odds the best way that I could. So, sure, I'd rather catch a big fish than a small fish. So would everyone else. That's why they fish for them.
Speaking of big fish, I get a little bit uncomfortable asking this only because the size to some people means different than others. Did you always seen the number 50 as being something special?
Yes.
So 49 is not?
Of course it is. It's a lot better than 48. But,
okay, good one.
well, right?
See, I like the guy that can think quick on his feet. I like that.
Well, I mean, I was happy to catch 49-pounders. Don't get me wrong. Yeah, I was upset they weren't 50, but I was glad they weren't 48. So you'd be happy for what you have, not for what you don't have.
That's true.
Always be someone who catches more and bigger fish than you, and there'll always be someone who catches less and smaller fish. So you just you just have to put yourself in the best position that you can. And to me, it just comes down to everyone skips over the same basic steps. It's like everyone wants to be a track runner, but no one wants to learn how to crawl first. So people just don't learn by their mistakes. Listen, there were no such things as tubes on hooks, like to protect the paint on a plug. This is so foreign to me. I just can't even grasp the concept. But what I can't grasp even more is someone admitting online that they fished all night with these tubes on. So what is that telling me? You never checked your hooks once. In the whole night, you never checked your hooks. You never checked to see if there was a scale on it. You never checked to see if the hook got bent on a rock. You never checked anything. How could you not know? I don't understand this. So that's what I mean about getting back to basics. It's like, I see it all the time. People, listen, they would, I should have changed that leader. That fish broke me off. Well, wait a second. You made a cast with a compromised leader. Now you're changing the leader and you didn't catch the fish. My way, I changed the leader and I did catch the fish. Which way makes more sense to you? So, certain things that to me were like just common sense, other people just prioritize their needs differently. We all respond differently to the same things, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to ask this then anyway. How many 50s?
And well, I'd rather not say.
There you go. Well, fair enough. This is why I was uncomfortable asking this question to begin with.
No, it's not. It's not that. Listen, plenty of guys got plenty more 50s, and plenty of guys who are much better fishermen don't have any.
Right.
So, well, yeah, it was very important to me, and a 50. I have a 50-pound 2-ounce fish, which to me is just as important as my 49 3/4 pound fish. But I don't call the 49 3/4 pound fish a 50 because it's not.
Mm-hmm.
But don't take that 2 ounces away from my 50. You know what I mean? I'll play the game straight, but if it's 50 pounds and 1 gram, it's a 50. And if it's 50 pounds less 1 gram, it's not a 50. And I don't really know too many people who say they have 49s. They seem to go from 45 pounds right up to 52, if you know what I mean.
No, I'm going to say from 33 up to 52, but that's just me.
Well, I can't tell you how many 50s I weighed for people that were in the 30s and 40s. And, you know, it's just the way it is. It's just the way it always was and just the way it always will be.